The cold came early that morning, low and biting, curling around the bricks of Carson Avenue like a warning. Harold Stokes tightened the scarf at his neck, the wool rough against his paper-thin skin. His footsteps were slower than the morning traffic light cycle, but not uncertain. In one trembling hand tucked close to his chest beneath his coat, he held the thing that had drawn him here every month for the past 28 years, a folded American flag, corners, dulled, red-faded edges, frayed like memory itself. He rounded the last corner, careful to avoid the uneven patches of sidewalk cracked by winter's wear. But when he approached the war memorial, his heart seized. Something was wrong. Chain-link fencing now wrapped around the site like a cage. Bright orange signs barked, site closed, redevelopment in progress. The polished granite slab that had once held his son's name was hidden behind bulldozers, gravel mounds, and tape. To the city, it was progress. To Harold, it was erasure. He stopped only a few paces from the fence, his breathing shallow. Beyond the metal links, almost obscured by construction, stood a single rose bush, stubborn and upright. It had survived 20 winters and more bulldozers than Harold could count. It was the place where his son Elijah had once played as a boy, where Harold had first laid the flag trembling the week after Fallujah stole his son. It was where he came each birthday, each November, and each Memorial Day, not to make speeches or draw attention, but to keep a promise. Today was Elijah's birthday. The wind pulled at the hem of Harold's coat. His shoes were worn but polished. The cane in his left hand bore a fading Marine Corps emblem. A few passers-by gave him a sideways glance. Another old man, another odd ritual. One teenager across the street, hoodie up and earbuds dangling, paused and began filming on his phone. Then came the voice. "What do you think you're doing, old man? You can't be here." Harold turned slowly. The voice belonged to a young police officer with mirrored sunglasses and a jaw clenched too tight for the hour. His badge read, C. Bowers. The officer's swagger seemed more meant for spectacle than safety. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Harold said quietly, one hand tightening around the flag. "I just need to place this. By that rose bush, I made a promise. The sign says the site's closed." Bowers snapped. "You can't just wander into a restricted area because you're feeling sentimental." There was no kindness in his voice, no recognition of the decades behind Harold's lined face. Just procedure, just distance. Harold looked past him, eyes fixed on the rose bush beyond the fence, lips moving in silent prayer. The construction equipment loomed behind it, uncaring. He took one slow step toward the gate. "I made a promise," he said again, barely louder than a whisper. Bowers stepped in front of him. "You made a mistake," he replied. "Step back before I have to escalate this." Escalate. The word echoed in Harold's mind like shrapnel. He remembered combat briefings using that same language. Escalation meant loss, meant smoke, and sirens meant body bags. Not here. Not now. A nurse in scrubs had stopped across the street. A man with grocery bags lingered at the corner. The teenager kept filming his camera, tilted for a better shot. Harold's spine straightened. The cane dropped slightly from his grip. "I served this country," he said. "That bush is where my boy's name used to be. Before they moved the wall, before they fenced it in like memory was something shameful." "Doesn't matter who you were," Bauer said. "This is now, and now you're trespassing." Harold took another step, not with rebellion but reverence. Dispatch Bowers said into his radio, "I've got a 10-96 non-compliant senior at the memorial site." "I'm not confused," Harold said louder now. "I know exactly where I am." The wind caught the corner of the flag. Harold's hand shot out to secure it, tender, as if he were cradling something alive. Then came the insult. Not yelled, just muttered. "Old fool." Harold blinked. Not at the words themselves, but at how casually they were given. As if a folded letter from the Pentagon, or years spent bandaging lives on foreign soil, could be dismissed with 2 syllables. He did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. He simply stood still. The silence was weighty until Bowers moved forward, one hand pressing against Harold's shoulder. The gesture was firm, not violent, but Harold staggered. The flag slipped. A gasp came from the bystanders, not for the movement, but for what it meant. Harold caught the flag before it hit the ground, barely pulling it against his chest like a wounded limb. His knees shook. His breath grew shallow. I told you to back off, Bowers snapped. This is a restricted zone. Across the street, the nurse stepped off the curb. The man with the groceries dropped his bag. The teenager stopped smirking. Just let him place it, someone whispered. Officer Geller, who had stood silent behind Bowers this entire time, finally spoke. Chris, he said softly. He's not armed. He's not yelling. He's not even crossing the fence. Just back off. Bowers turned surprised. Are you serious? That's non-compliance. That's a charge. Geller stared at Harold. He's not resisting. He's remembering. There's a difference. A hush fell over the scene like a held breath. Bowers barked again, louder this time. This indulgent nonsense is why these people think they're above the rules. These people, the nurse spat now only a few feet away. You mean veterans or old men with broken hearts? Bowers didn't answer. Couldn't. Harold turned again toward the rose bush behind the fence. His hand still cradled the flag. His voice was quieter now, but unmistakable. You don't have to know my story, he said, but you damn well don't get to erase it. Then from down the block came a sound, a low, smooth hum, an engine too heavy to be a sedan, too confident to belong to anything unimportant. A black SUV turned the corner. No one noticed at first, except Harold. His eyes stayed on the rose bush. He whispered, "Son, if you're watching, I'm keeping my word." Earlier that morning, Harold Stokes was stopped by a young officer while trying to place a folded flag at the rose bush near the fenced-off war memorial, his silent ritual to honor his fallen son. The moment escalated when the officer laid hands on Harold and a crowd began to gather. Rain came without thunder, a soft but steady drizzle that pressed against the pavement and soaked the fabric of time. It blurred the sounds of the city into something gentler, but it could not erase the sting left behind on Carson Avenue. Harold still knelt at the edge of the construction fence, the folded flag cradled in both hands, his breath fogging faintly in the gray light. Around him, the small crowd remained no longer out of curiosity, but something closer to reverence. Even so, the air buzzed with tension. Raindrops danced off cell phone screens. The teenager, still filming, rotated his phone sideways for a better angle, mumbling through a crooked grin. Dude's hugging a rag like it's the Declaration or something. A laugh answered him, then another. Laughter, a sound that should have stayed far from sacred places, found its way into the moment. Harold didn't flinch, but something inside him shifted, subtle and grave. Not anger, not shame. Just weight, the kind that doesn't make your shoulders slump, but makes your breath come slower. The flag in his lap wasn't just cloth. It was a promise carried for decades. It had crossed oceans. It had draped caskets. It had dried his wife Marion's eyes when Elijah's name arrived in a letter from the Pentagon. It had been folded and unfolded so many times Harold could do it with his eyes closed. And now it was being laughed at. Officer Geller took a step forward, his gaze locked on the smirking teen. "You think that's funny?" he asked quietly. The boy shrugged. "It's just some boomer drama. Chill." It was the nurse who answered him, her voice low like a scalpel sliding beneath skin. "You laugh at this now," she said, "but one day your hands will shake, your back will ache, and no one will remember what you stood for. Maybe because you never stood for anything." The boy didn't reply. He lowered his phone slowly, and the smirk bled from his face. But the damage had been done. The insult hung in the air like smoke, bitter and hard to shake. Harold didn't move. He reached up, brushed a speck of dust from the corner of the flag, as though it had been wounded too. Then he lifted his eyes not to the crowd, but to the rose bush beyond the fence, blooming red despite the ruin around it. He murmured not to anyone but himself. Her hands were smaller than mine. She stitched it herself. Said it'd bring us both home. From behind him, Bowers scoffed. "Here we go. The old war tale. What is it this time? Saved a whole platoon with a bayonet and a prayer." Harold turned slowly. His voice didn't rise. "I didn't save anyone," he said. "I buried most of them." The silence that followed was different. No longer strained or skeptical, just still. And then something shifted. The first SUV, sleek black and official, rolled to a slow halt on Carson Avenue. Most eyes stayed fixed on Harold, but a few heads turned. Then a second SUV pulled up behind it, and a third. Inside the second vehicle, a man in a dark suit opened the door, stepped into the rain and stood still. Not many noticed him right away, but Harold did. The man's shoes were polished, his stance efficient, his expression calm but focused. He crossed the street without hesitation, passing the murmuring crowd and the rustling canopy of umbrellas. Officer Bowers' tensed instinct flashing across his face. "Sir, this is a police matter." He began, taking a step forward. The man didn't flinch. His tone was quiet, but it cut cleaner than a shout. "And you've already made it worse." Bowers blinked. "Who are you?" The man ignored him and knelt beside Harold, not in sympathy, but in something closer to reverence. He placed a hand on Harold's shoulder, gentle but firm. "Is it really you?" he asked softly. "Staff Sergeant Stokes." Harold turned his head, surprise blinking across his expression. His name in uniform hadn't been spoken aloud in years. "I was 6, the man said, when you carried my father off the field in Mosul. He bled through your hands. You didn't let him die alone. I've spent my life trying to live up to that moment." A murmur swept through the onlookers. Bowers opened his mouth and shut it. Harold looked down at the flag in his lap, really looked for the first time in years. His fingers trembled as they unfolded one edge. There, just below the crease, slightly off-center, was the thread. A stitch not issued by the military, not embroidered by machine. ELS Elijah Leonard Stokes, faded but intact. Harold's breath hitched. The man in the suit nodded. "Elijah was 22. You carried him longer than any man should have to." No one spoke. No phones were held up. The teenager had tucked his device into his pocket. The nurse crossed her arms and stepped back slightly, allowing the moment its space. Harold's grip on the flag tightened, not to shield it this time, but to share it. "I was supposed to burn it," he whispered. "Battlefield protocol. If it's soiled—" The man raised an eyebrow. "Why didn't you?" "Because she asked me not to," Harold said. "Marion." She stitched the initials after Elijah enlisted. Said if she couldn't hold his hand, she'd settle for him holding something she made. The man stood slowly and extended his hand, not in command but invitation. "You don't have to place it behind a fence anymore, Staff Sergeant. You've earned more than that." Harold didn't take his hand. Not yet. But he did rise, inch by inch, rain soaking his collar and spine pain flashing in his hip like lightning. And as he stood, the crowd parted, not with applause or pity, but something better. Recognition. As Harold Stokes knelt before the fenced-off war memorial, mocked and dismissed, a stranger stepped forward, Colonel Mason Dillard, the child of a man Harold saved decades ago. Recognizing the stitched initials in Harold's flag, Dillard spoke the truth aloud, breaking the silence that had buried Harold's story for too long. The street had grown unnaturally quiet. Even the rain seemed to pause, falling softer as if eavesdropping. Harold stood beside Colonel Dillard, the folded flag in his hands, heavier now, not from weight but from meaning finally seen. Then came the shift. From the third black SUV, a man stepped out. He wore no uniform, no medals, just a dark civilian coat. But something in the way he moved, measured, deliberate, with a stillness earned in fire, made the bystanders take a step back. His face was lined not by time alone, but by decisions no one should have to make. A silver lapel pin, small and unmistakable. 5 stars. General Stanton. No one had noticed him until now. But when he stepped forward, no one looked anywhere else. He stopped in front of Harold. Rain dotted his shoulders. He didn't wipe it away. Instead, he lifted his right hand to his brow and saluted. A textbook perfect, unflinching, 5-second salute. No ceremony, no performance. Harold stared, stunned. He hadn't been saluted in over 50 years. Not since Korea. Not since the snow and blood on Hill 108. The general's hand stayed in place. Harold's throat worked to find air. His knees quivered. Then slowly he lifted his own hand, unsteady, weathered, and returned the gesture. Not with crispness, but with every memory that still lived in his bones. Only then did the general lower his arm. He stepped forward, voice low but clear. "Staff Sergeant Harold Stokes," he said, "I've read your field report from Hill 108 5 times. But I didn't understand what it really meant until this morning." Harold blinked. "That was a long time ago, General." Stanton nodded. Too long, and too long unacknowledged. He turned to face the crowd now gathering at the edge of the sidewalk. Many held their breath, Others wept openly. This man, Stanton declared, held a perimeter against 2 divisions for 6 hours while his company bled around him. He had no food, no backup, no orders. He stayed not for glory, not for medals, but because he was the last one left. And he knew if he moved, the dead would be forgotten, and the wounded would die. Gasps broke across the crowd. One mother pulled her son closer. A teenager removed his hood. A small boy asked softly, "Is he a real soldier?" "No," his father said, voice choked. "He's the soldier." General Stanton turned back to Harold. "I want to apologize," he said, voice gentler now, "for every time this country asked you to be strong, but not visible, brave, but not remembered." Harold shook his head. "I didn't do it to be remembered." "I know," Stanton said. "That's why we must." From behind, Colonel Dillard approached holding a small wooden box, polished mahogany worn at the corners. "This belonged to Major Franklin Rhodes," he said quietly, handing it over. "Elijah's commanding officer. He asked that it be given to the man who kept his promise." Harold opened the box slowly. Inside a dog tag, 2 worn medals, a photo Elijah in desert fatigues, grinning with Harold's younger hand on his shoulder. Harold's legs gave. He stumbled. Stanton caught him before he fell. The flag tumbled but never touched the ground. Dillard caught it mid-air, folded it tighter, and placed it reverently back in Harold's arms. Officer Geller approached, cap in hand, face solemn. "I didn't see you," he said. "I looked, but I didn't see." Harold nodded slowly. "Most don't." "I will now," Geller promised, "and I'll make sure others do." Behind him, Officer Bowers hadn't moved. His face was pale, eyes fixed on the ground. Arrogance gone. What was left looked a lot like shame. General Stanton faced the crowd again. "Let it be known," he said, "this ground is not being cleared. It's being consecrated. This man, this flag, this promise will not be bulldozed. Not by indifference, not by ignorance, not by a city contract." A soft cheer rose, tentative, respectful, but Harold didn't hear it. He stepped forward, walked past the broken barrier, and reached the rose bush. He knelt again on one knee, rain soaking into the seams of his trousers. With quiet care, he placed the flag beneath the bush. He adjusted the corners, smoothed the edges. No one interrupted, no one filmed, no one laughed. A single drop of rain hit a rose petal, then another. By the time Harold stood again, the sky had opened in a gentle, steady rain, falling like the breath of something greater than the moment. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of dismissal. After decades of silence, Harold Stokes was finally seen. Not as an old man with a folded flag, but as a soldier, a father, and a keeper of promises. A salute from a 4-star general, the tearful recognition of his son's sacrifice, and a crowd that once watched in confusion now stood in reverent stillness. Unending. By early afternoon, the storm had passed. The rain left behind a hush, a kind of damp warmth that clung to the skin and softened the world's edges. Carson Avenue, once lined with fences and noise, stood quiet under the faded gray sky. The war memorial was still ringed in chain link, but something had shifted. The metal no longer looked like a barrier. It looked like an apology waiting to be undone. A city official arrived in a pressed blazer, his shoes too clean for the cracked sidewalk. His aides flanked him, their clipboards damp from drizzle. He cleared his throat before addressing the remaining crowd, which had neither grown nor shrunk. It had simply settled like roots. "We've spoken with General Stanton," the official said, "and with representatives from the Veterans Historical Committee. Effective immediately, the redevelopment plan is suspended." A ripple of soft approval moved through the crowd. No applause, just the exhale of relief. "In the coming weeks," he continued, "a public review will determine how this space is preserved. Veterans' voices, especially those of Mr. Stokes and others, will guide the process." He hesitated, searching for the right phrase. No fence, he added, should ever be built to keep out memory. Behind him, Colonel Dillard stepped forward, his voice steel under velvet. "Respect isn't a press release. It's what happens when no one's watching." He turned to Harold. "And today they watched you, mocked you, shoved you, because they saw an old man instead of a legacy." He paused. "They were wrong." Harold didn't speak. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a pin dulled by years of wear. He held it for a moment, studying it in his palm, then placed it into Dillard's hand. "I wore that in '53, he said. "Let it mean something now." Dillard bowed his head. That simple bronze service pin, plain to most, weighed more in that moment than any metal ever could. Behind them, officers Geller and Bowers still stood. They had not left, though duty had long since released them. Geller stepped forward, hat in hand. "Would you like to stay while we clear the site?" he asked. Harold smiled faintly. "No need," he said. "I already did what I came to do." As he stood, the light caught the flag again, just a shimmer. Not from moisture, from reverence. Not from age, from endurance. Colonel Dillard appeared at his side. "I'll walk you home." "Good," Harold said, his voice softer now. But slowly, of course. They walked together through the parting crowd. No applause, no cheers, just nods, quiet hands to hearts, a whispered thank you here, a bowed head there. By the time Harold reached the end of the block, half the fence had already been dismantled. Clip by clip, link by link. It came down not violently, not defiantly, just patiently, carefully, and rightfully. The rosebush was moved gently just a few feet toward the east, where sunlight lingered longer, and the earth stayed soft into spring. No fanfare marked the change, but there beside it, a small bronze plaque was placed. No ribbon, no speeches, just 10 words, etched deep, unpolished, unmistakable for the promise he kept and the silence he bore. Harold never asked for that plaque. In fact, when the city offered a dedication with cameras and a ribbon to cut, he politely declined. He didn't want speeches. He didn't want generals. He wanted a bench. They gave him one dark wood curved back, smooth and unmarked. It faced the rose bush. The flag was no longer placed there. It now rested preserved under glass at the local history hall beside Harold's coat and Marion's stitched initials. Not stretched, not draped. Just as he had held it, that bench became something else, a kind of sanctuary. Widows came with thermoses of coffee and photographs folded in their wallets. Veterans came knees stiff, eyes quiet, hands brushing the plaque like a remembered prayer. Even teenagers came, phones turned off, listening to the stillness. Harold came less often. His knees ached more. The winters stayed longer. But when he came, he always brought two things, a folded flag and a rose. He never laid them down at the same time. The flag was for memory. The rose was for the ones still blooming. And then one spring morning, he didn't come. The staff at the Veterans Housing Complex said he passed in his sleep. His coat was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. Beneath it, a slip of paper, 4 words written in a hand just barely steady. "Let it stay here." They honored it. Bowers was there at the museum dedication. He had left the force 6 months earlier and now worked at a nonprofit for homeless veterans. He brought students from the local high school to visit the memorial every week. Some days he just sat on the bench and said nothing. Geller came often, sometimes with his grandfather. They never spoke while they were there. They didn't need to. Colonel Dillard returned on the 11th of each month, always in uniform, never saying why. And General Stanton, he never gave another speech, never sought another headline. But the day they raised the new flag at the memorial, months after Harold's passing, he was there, hat over hard eyes glistening. The rose bush still blooms. The bench still waits. And though Harold Stokes no longer walks those quiet paths, the rag he once carried, mocked, dismissed, nearly torn from his hands, remains. Respected, remembered, and folded just right.